for the canonical penalty of excommunication as regulated by the Code of Canon Law of 1917 and the present code. See Excommunication #Catholic Church. This article reflects the state of before 1917. In the canon law of the Catholic Church, excommunication, the principal and severest censure, is a medicinal, spiritual penalty that deprives the guilty Christian of all participation in the common blessings of ecclesiastical society. Being a penalty, it supposes guilt, and being the most serious penalty that the Catholic Church can inflict, it naturally supposes a very grave offense. It is also a medicinal rather than a vindictive penalty, being intended not so much to punish the culprit, as to correct him and bring him back to the path of righteousness. It necessarily, therefore, contemplates the future, either to prevent the recurrence of certain culpable acts that have grievous external consequences, or, more especially, to induce the delinquent to satisfy the obligations incurred by their offense. Its object and its effect are loss of communion, i.e., of the spiritual benefits shared by all the members of Christian society. Hence, it can affect only those who by baptism have been admitted to that society. Undoubtedly there can and do exist other penal measures which entail the loss of certain fixed rights. Among them are other censures, e.g., suspension for clerics, interdict for clerics and laymen, irregularity ex delicto, etc. Excommunication, however, is clearly distinguished from these penalties in that it is the privation of all rights resulting from the social status of the Christian as such. Excommunicated persons do not cease to be Christians, since the baptism can never be effaced. They can, however, be considered as an exile from Christian society and as non-existent, for a time at least, in the sight of ecclesiastical authority. But such exile can have an end as soon as the offender has given suitable satisfaction. Meanwhile, the status before the Church is that of a stranger. They may not participate in public worship nor receive any of the sacraments. Moreover, if a cleric, he is forbidden to administer a sacred rite or to exercise an act of spiritual authority. General notions and historical summary. Right of the Church to excommunicate. The right to excommunicate is an immediate and necessary consequence of the fact that the Church is a society. Every society has the right to exclude and deprive of the rights and social advantages its unworthy or grievously culpable members, either temporarily or permanently. This right is necessary to every society in order that it may be well administered and survive. The fundamental proof, therefore, of the Church's right to excommunicate is based on her status as a spiritual society, whose members, governed by legitimate authority, seek one and the same end through suitable means. Members who, by their obstinate disobedience, reject the means of attaining this common end deserve to be removed from such a society. This rational argument is confirmed by texts of the New Testament, the example of the Apostles, and the practice of the Church from the first ages down to the present. Among the Jews, exclusion from the synagogue was a real excommunication. This was the exclusion feared by the parents of the man born blind, the same likewise that Christ foretold to his disciples. It is also the exclusion which in due time the Christian Church should exercise. And if he will not hear the Church, let him be to thee as the heathen and publican. In the celebrated text, whatsoever you shall bind upon earth shall be bound also in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose upon earth shall be loosed also in heaven. It is not only the remission of sins that is referred to, but likewise all spiritual jurisdiction, including judicial and penal sanctions. Such, moreover, was the jurisdiction conferred on St. Peter by the words, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep." St. Paul excommunicated regularly the incestuous Corinthian and the incorrigible blasphemers whom he delivered over to Satan. Faithful to the apostolic teaching and example, the Church, for the very earliest ages, was wont to excommunicate heretics and contumacious persons. Since the 4th century, numerous conciliary canons pronounce excommunication against those who are guilty of certain offences. Of the facts there can be no doubt. Excommunication not only external. In first Christian centuries it is not always easy to distinguish between excommunication and penitential exclusion. To differentiate them satisfactorily we must await the decline of the institution of public penance and the well-defined separation between those things appertaining to the forum internum, or tribunal of conscience, and the forum externum, or public ecclesiastical tribunal. Nevertheless, the admission of a sinner to the performance of public penance was consequent on a previous genuine excommunication. On the other hand, formal exclusion from reception of the Eucharist and the other sacraments was only mitigated excommunication and identical with minor excommunication. At any rate, in the first centuries, excommunication is not regarded as a simple external measure. It reaches the soul and the conscience. It is not merely the severing of the outward bond which holds individual to the place in the Church, it severs also the internal bond, and the sentence pronounced on earth is considered ratified in heaven. It is the spiritual sword, the heaviest penalty that the Church can inflict. Hence in the papal bull Exsurge Domini, Leo X condemned Luther's 23rd proposition, according to which excommunications are merely external punishments, nor do they deprive a man of the common spiritual prayers of the Church. Pius VI also condemned the 46th proposition of the Pseudo-Synod of Pistoia, which maintained that the effect of excommunication is only exterior because of its own nature. It excludes only from exterior communion with the Church. As if, said the Pope, excommunication were not of spiritual penalty binding in heaven and affecting souls. The proposition was therefore condemned as false, pernicious, already reprobated in the 23rd proposition of Luther, and, to say the least, erroneous. The Catholic Church cannot oppose any obstacle to the internal relations of the soul with God. It even implores God to give the grace of repentance to the excommunicated. The rites of the Church, nevertheless, are always the providential and regular channel through which divine grace is conveyed to Christians. Exclusion from such rites, especially from the sacraments, entails the privation of this grace, to whose sources the excommunicated person no longer has access. History of excommunication. While excommunication ranks first among ecclesiastical censures, it existed long before any such classification arose. For the earliest days of the Christian society it was the chief ecclesiastical penalty for laymen. For guilty clerics the first punishment was deposition from their office, i.e., reduction to the ranks of the laity. Subsequently, when ecclesiastical discipline allowed clerics more easily to resume the ministry, the ancient deposition became suspension. Thenceforth even clerics were subject to excommunication, by which they lost at once the rights as Christians and as clerics. Both laymen and clerics were henceforth threatened or punished with excommunication for offences that became daily more definite and numerous, particularly for refusing obedience either to special ecclesiastical precepts of the general laws of the Church. Once the forum externum, or public ecclesiastical tribunal, was distinctly separated from the forum sacramental, or tribunal of sacramental penance. Say from the 9th century on, excommunication became gradually an ever more powerful means of spiritual government, a sort of coercive measure ensuring ensuring the exact accomplishment of the laws of the Church and the precepts of her prelates. Excommunication was either threatened or inflicted in order to secure the observance of fasts and feasts, the payment of tithes, the obedience of inferiors, the denunciation of the guilty, also to compel the faithful to make known to ecclesiastical authority matrimonial impediments and other information. Abuses. This extension of the use of excommunication led to abuses, the infliction of so grave a penalty for offences of a less grievous kind and most frequently impossible to verify before the public ecclesiastical authority, begot eventually a contempt for excommunication. Consequently, the Council of Trent was forced to recommend to all bishops and prelates more moderation in the use of censures. The passage is too significant to be here omitted. Although the sword of excommunication is the very sinews of ecclesiastical discipline, and very salutary for keeping the people to the observance of their duty, yet it is to be used with sobriety and great circumspection, seeing that experience teaches that if it be wielded rashly or for slight causes, it is more despised than feared, and works more evil than good. Wherefore, such excommunications which are wont to be issued for the purpose of provoking a revelation, or on account of things lost or stolen, shall be issued by no one whomsoever but the bishop, and not then, except on account of some uncommon circumstance which moves the bishop thereunto, and after the matter has been by him diligently and very maturely weighed. Then follow equally explicit measures for the use of censures in judicial matters. This recommendation of the Council of Trent has been duly heeded, and the use of censures as a means of coercion has grown constantly rarer, the more so as it is hardly ever possible for the Church to obtain from the civil power the execution of such penalties. Excessive number of excommunications. In the course of time, also, the number of canonical excommunications was excessively multiplied, which fact, coupled with the frequent desuetude, made it difficult to know whether many among them were always in force. The difficulty was greater as a large number of these excommunications were reserved, for which reason theologians with much ingenuity construed favorably said reservation and permitted the majority of the faithful to obtain absolution without presenting themselves in Rome, or indeed even writing thither. In recent times the number of excommunications in force has been greatly diminished, and a new method of absolving from them has been inaugurated. It will doubtless find a place in the new codification of the canon law that is being prepared. Thus, without change of nature, excommunication in foro externo has become an exceptional penalty, reserved for very grievous offences detrimental to Christian society. In foro interno it has been diminished and mitigated, at least in regard to the conditions for absolution from it. However, as can readily be seen from a perusal of the excommunications actually in force, it still remains true that what the Church aims at is not so much the crime as the satisfaction to be obtained from the culprits in consequence of their offense. Refusal of ecclesiastical communion. Finally, real excommunication must not be confounded with a measure formerly quite frequent, and sometimes even known as excommunication, but which was rather a refusal of episcopal communion. It was the refusal by a bishop to communicate in sacris with another bishop and his church, in consideration of an act deemed reprehensible and worthy of chastisement. It was undoubtedly with this withdrawal of communion that Pope Victor threatened the bishops of Asia in the Paschal controversy. It was certainly the measure to which St. Martin of Tours had recourse when he refused to communicate with the Spanish bishops who caused Emperor Maximinus to condemn to death the heretic Priscillian with some of his adherents. Moreover, a similar privation of communion was in early Christian times imposed by councils as a regular penalty for bishops found guilty of certain minor faults. The most frequent example is that of bishops who, without good reason, neglected to attend the provincial council. These bishops were evidently not excommunicated. Properly speaking, they continued to govern the dioceses and publicly to hold ecclesiastical services. They were simply deprived, as the aforesaid texts say, of the consolation of communion with their episcopal brethren. Kinds of excommunication: major and minor excommunication. Until recently, excommunication was of two kinds: major and minor. Minor excommunication. Minor excommunication is uniformly defined by canonists and by Gregory IX as prohibition from receiving the sacraments, what theologians call the passive use of the sacraments. In order to receive the Eucharist and the other sacraments, those who had incurred this penalty had to be absolved therefrom, as it was not reserved. This could be done by any confessor. Indirectly, however, it entailed other consequences. The canon law taught that the priest who celebrates Mass while under the ban of minor excommunication sins grievously, also that he sins similarly in administering the sacraments, and finally, that while he can vote for others, he himself is ineligible to a canonical office. This is readily understood when we remember that the cleric thus excommunicated was presumed to be in the state of grievous sin, and that such a state is an obstacle to the lawful celebration of Mass and the administration of the sacraments. Minor excommunication was rarely identical with the state of the penitents of older times who, prior to the reconciliation, was admitted to public penance. Minor excommunication was incurred by unlawful intercourse with the excommunicated, and in the beginning no exception was made of any class of excommunicated persons. Owing, however, to many inconveniences arising from this condition of things, especially after excommunications had become so numerous, Martin V, by the Constitution Ad Evitandus Candela, restricted the aforesaid unlawful intercourse to that held with those who were formerly named as persons to be shunned and who were therefore known as vitadi, also with those who were notoriously guilty of striking a cleric. But as this twofold category was in modern times greatly reduced, but little attention was paid to minor excommunication, and eventually it ceased to exist after the publication of the Constitution Apostolici Sedis. The latter declared that all excommunications latae sententiae that it did not mention were abolished, and as it was silent concerning minor excommunication, canonists concluded that minor excommunication no longer existed. This conclusion was formally ratified by the Holy Office. Major excommunication. Major excommunication, which remains now the only kind in force, is therefore the kind of which we treat below, and to which our definition fully applies. Anathema is a sort of aggravated excommunication, from which, however, it does not differ essentially, but simply in the matter of special solemnities and outward display. A jure and ab hominem excommunication is either a jure or ab hominem. The first is provided by the law itself, which declares that whosoever shall have been guilty of a definite crime will incur the penalty of excommunication. The second is inflicted by an ecclesiastical prelate, either when he issues a serious order under pain of excommunication or imposes this penalty by judicial sentence and after a criminal trial. Latin ferendi sententia e excommunication, especially a jury, is either Latin ferendi sententia e. The first is incurred as soon as the offense is committed and by reason of the offense itself without intervention of any ecclesiastical judge. It is recognized in the terms used by the legislator. For instance, the culprit will be excommunicated at once by the fact itself. The second is indeed foreseen by the law as a penalty, but is inflicted on the culprit only by a judicial sentence. In other words, the delinquent is rather threatened than visited with the penalty, and incurs it only when the judge has summoned him before his tribunal, declared him guilty and punished him according to the terms of the law. It is recognized when the law contains these or similar words. Under pain of excommunication, the culprit will be excommunicated. Public and occult. Excommunication ferendi sententia e can be public only, as it must be the object of a declaratory sentence pronounced by a judge, but excommunication lati sententia e may be either public or occult. It is public through the publicity of the law when it is imposed and published by ecclesiastical authority. It is public through notoriety of fact, when the offense that has incurred it is known to the majority in the locality, as in the case of those who have publicly done violence to clerics, or of the purchasers of church property. On the contrary, excommunication is occult when the offense entailing it is known to no one or almost no one. The first is valid in the forum externum and consequently in the forum internum. The second is valid in the forum internum only. The practical difference is very important. He who has incurred occult excommunication should treat himself as excommunicated and be absolved as soon as possible, submitting to whatever conditions will be imposed upon him, but this only in the tribunal of conscience. He is not obliged to denounce himself to a judge nor to abstain from external acts connected with the exercise of jurisdiction, and he may ask absolution without making himself known either in confession or to the sacred penitentiary. According to the teaching of Benedict XIV, a sentence declaratory of the offense is always necessary in the forum externum, since in this tribunal no one is presumed to be excommunicated unless convicted of a crime that entails such a penalty. Public excommunication, on the other hand, is removed only by a public absolution. When it is question of simple publicity of fact, the absolution, while not judicial, is nevertheless public, inasmuch as it is given to a known person and appears as an act of the forum externum. Vitadi intolerati. Public excommunication in foro externo has 2 degrees according as it has or has not been formally published, or, in other words, according as excommunicated persons are to be shunned or tolerated. A formally published nominative excommunication occurs when the sentence has been brought to the knowledge of the public by a notification from the judge, indicating by name the person thus punished. No special method is required for this publication, according to the Council of Constance. It suffices that the sentence have been published or made known by the judge in a special and express manner. Persons thus excommunicated are to be shunned, i.e., the faithful must have no intercourse with them either in regard to sacred things or profane matters, as we shall see farther on. All other excommunicated persons, even though known, are tolerati, i.e., the law no longer obliges the faithful to abstain from intercourse with them, even in religious matters. This distinction dates from the aforesaid constitution ad evitandus candela, published by Martin V at the Council of Constance in 1418. Until then one had to avoid communion with all the excommunicated, once they were known as such, to avoid scandal and numerous dangers, says Martin V, and to relieve timorous consciences. We hereby mercifully grant to all the faithful that henceforth no one need refrain refrain from communicating with another in the reception or administration of the sacraments, or in other matters divine or profane, under pretext of any ecclesiastical sentence or censure, whether promulgated in general form by law or by a judge, nor avoid anyone whomsoever, nor observe an ecclesiastical interdict, except when this sentence or censure shall have been published or made known by the judge in special and express form, against some certain specified person, college, university, church, community, or place. But while notoriously excommunicated persons are no longer vitati, the Pope makes an exception of those who have incurred the penalty of excommunication by reason of sacrilegious violence against a cleric, and so notoriously that the fact can in no way be dissimulated or excused. He declares, moreover, that he has not made this concession in favor of the excommunicated, whose condition remains unchanged, but solely for the benefit of the faithful. Hence, in virtue of ecclesiastical law, the latter need no longer deprive themselves of intercourse with those of the excommunicated who are tolerated. As to the vitati, now reduced to the two aforementioned categories, they must be shunned by the faithful as formerly. It is to be noted now that the minor excommunication incurred formerly by these forbidden relations has been suppressed. Also, that of the major excommunications inflicted on certain definite acts of communion with the vitati, only two are retained in the Constitution Apostolici Sedis, that inflicted on any of the faithful for participation in a crime that has merited nominative excommunication by the Pope, and the pronounced against clerics alone for spontaneous and conscious communion in sacris with persons whom the Pope has excommunicated by name. Moreover, those whom bishops excommunicate by name are as much vitati as of those similarly excommunicated by the Pope, reserved and non-reserved. Finally, excommunication is either reserved or non-reserved. This division affects the absolution from censure. In the forum internum, any confessor can absolve from non-reserved excommunications, but those that are reserved can only be remitted, except through indulta delegation, by those to whom the law reserves the absolution. There is a distinction between excommunications reserved to the Pope and those reserved to bishops or ordinaries. As to excommunications ab hominem, absolution from them is reserved by law to the judge who has inflicted them. In a certain sense, excommunications may also be reserved in view of the persons who incur them. Thus, absolution from excommunications in foro externo incurred by bishops is reserved to the Pope. Again, custom reserves to him the excommunication of sovereigns, those who can excommunicate. Excommunication is an act of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, the rules of which it follows. Hence the general principle, whoever has jurisdiction in the forum externum, properly so called, can excommunicate, but only his own subjects. Therefore, whether excommunications be alia or ab hominem, they may come from the Pope alone or a general council for the entire Catholic Church, for the provincial council for an ecclesiastical province, for the bishop for his diocese, from the prelate nullus for quasi-diocesan territories, and from regular prelates for religious orders. Moreover, anyone can excommunicate who, by virtue of his office, even when delegated, has contentious jurisdiction in the forum externum, for instance, papal legates, vicars capitular, and vicars general. But a parish priest cannot inflict this penalty nor even declare that it is incurred, i.e., he cannot do so in an official and judicial manner. The subjects of these various authorities are those who come under their jurisdiction chiefly on account of domicile or quasi-domicile in their territory, then by reason of the offense committed while on such territory, and finally by reason of personal right, as in the case of regulars.